The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Robert, do you remember the first time you ever voted?
Yes, I do. It was actually a referendum in the state of Rhode Island the year I turned 18. It was something to do with funding for the prison in Rhode Island. I don't remember the details, but I remember being excited that I turned 18 and I could actually vote. And I had grown up in the state of Rhode Island, and there was some little referendum on the ballot. I think that was all that there was, and it was exciting to me.
Do you remember how you voted?
I do not. I remember it had something to do with it's called the ACI in Rhode Island, the Adult Correctional Institution. There was something, I think, perhaps borrowing money. It was one of these issues that no one outside Rhode Island would care about, but I just remember being excited to vote. I don't even remember how I voted.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Robert Speel. He's a college professor at Penn State Behrend who focuses on aspects of American politics that include elections and voting behavior, Congress and the presidency, and public policy. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Robert about a few times in history where the results of an election were contested. Robert, how did you become so interested in focusing on politics and elections in your academic work?
I guess, I came from a family who discussed politics when I was a child, and they would be arguing about Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War and civil rights and issues like that, and we had different opinions in my family, and while I didn't probably understand most of it when I was 10 years old, I knew it was important, and I knew it got people excited. And then when I got old enough myself to start following politics, I just found it interesting. I mean, most of my friends love baseball and football and basketball and get excited about who wins. And to me, it was more exciting to follow presidential candidates who won, because to me, it actually mattered more than who had won the sports game, the night before. So I don't know. I've stayed interested. What happened actually is as a college student, I was involved in political activism where I worked for candidates and things like that. And I found out I didn't necessarily like doing that a lot. I was more interested in sort of analyzing and studying why people do what they do in politics. And that's how I entered the academic side of it.
Now, was there any particular part of politics that you focus on?
Voting behavior, basically why people vote the way they do and how they vote. I wrote a book for Penn State Press many years ago called Changing Patterns of Voting in the Northern United States. And it's largely, as the South began to move more Republican in elections, I was focusing on why many northern states that had voted Republican for 100 years after the Civil War were suddenly voting for Democrats. And it was just kind of, how do people decide how to vote and why do they vote that way? And that's the kind of thing I tend to focus on in my research.
You wrote an article for the Smithsonian where you mentioned that there's a history of candidates and the media crying foul over what they perceived as suspicious results. In your research, are there any claims that seem more credible than others?
Well, certainly some of the early ones in history. I mean, the 1824 election, the 1876 election, which was one of the articles that was in the Smithsonian, that was pretty clearly rigged. I mean, the southern states were occupied by Northern Union troops at the time, and there was all kinds of voter intimidation at polling places, and no one to this day really knows who won.
Who were the candidates in that race?
The Republican was Rutherford Hayes, and the Democrat was Samuel Tilden, and Republicans had controlled the presidency since 1861 when Lincoln became president, and they didn't want to give it up. But southern states after the Civil War were voting Democrat again because basically they didn't like the Civil War, and the Democrats were the party that had not prosecuted the Civil War. And there was just lots of vote buying and intimidation at polls and back then people actually voted publicly. I mean, everyone could see how you voted. It wasn't a private ballot. And there were all kinds of shenanigans going on, and no one really knows who won, and many of the states were probably rigged.
Some of the states involved in that particular scandal were Florida, Louisiana and South Carolina. And
Right.
I think Tilden won those states due to widespread allegations of intimidation and fraud. But how did it work out? How did they end up settling things in that particular scandal?
Well, in the earliest vote results, it looked like Tilden, the Democrat, had won those states. However, there was all kinds of voter intimidation at the polls. At that time, and just as, for the next 100 years, most white people in the South were voting Democrat. And African Americans, the newly freed slaves after the Civil War, were mainly voting Republican. That was the party that had freed the slaves. And in that 1876 election, a lot of white voters, including groups like the Ku Klux Klan, blocked a lot of African Americans from voting. There was lots of intimidation. There was a lot of voter fraud and ballot stuffing. So while some early results showed Tilden winning those 3 states, the Republicans who ran the election offices in those states claimed that Hayes, the Republican, had won the 3 states. And they sent competing sets of election returns to Washington. The Constitution actually says that Congress counts the votes in January after the election. So Congress had 2 sets of competing election returns to choose between for that election. And Congress didn't know how to deal with it. So they decided to appoint a 15-member commission of members of Congress and Supreme Court judges decide who won the election. And they appointed 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent, who was a Supreme Court justice named David Davis. Now, for various reasons, David Davis then later resigned. And when he resigned, he was replaced on the commission by a Republican. And the commission then voted 8-7 that Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, won all the disputed electoral votes. And by winning all the disputed electoral votes from the states you mentioned, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, he got an electoral college majority of 185 to 184. And by winning those disputed electoral votes by 1 electoral vote, Rutherford Hayes became president. But it also led to what was then known as the Compromise of 1877, in which Democrats agreed not to protest the Republican Rutherford Hayes becoming president. In return, Republicans agreed to end Reconstruction and withdraw Union troops from the South, which then, of course, led to 100 years of strong discrimination against African Americans in the South. It had a very historic result of that election, a long-term result.
So what do you think happened because of that compromise? I mean, what are some of the details of things that sort of left a long trail after that?
Largely the fact that when Union troops withdrew from the South and ended Reconstruction, before many voters were willing to accept the fact that African Americans deserved equal rights in the South, that led to a pattern. Within a couple of decades, all the southern states had passed laws mandating segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and all the southern states began to pass laws coming up with ways to block African Americans from voting, literacy tests, poll taxes, lots of intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups at polling places. And almost all African Americans were blocked from voting in the South for the next 100 years, which obviously had a big impact on national politics.
When did the secret ballot come in?
Actually, a big factor that caused most states to adopt the secret ballot came after another contested, disputed election in the presidential election of 1888. In 1888, the Democratic incumbent Grover Cleveland was running for re-election. His Republican opponent was Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison had hired as a treasurer for his campaign another man from Indiana, which is where Benjamin Harrison was from. The man's name was William Wade Dudley, and he was appointed as treasurer of the Republican National Committee. And shortly before the election, Dudley sent a letter to Republican local leaders in Indiana with promised funds and instructions to divide susceptible voters into blocks of 5 to receive bribes to vote Republican. This was common in the late 19th century when people voted openly. You could bribe them how to vote because you knew that if they didn't vote the way you wanted, they didn't get their bribe. So people watched how people voted. Democrats got a copy of that letter and made a big fuss about it. It became known as the Blocks of 5 scandal. Harrison then went on to win his home state of Indiana by a small margin, and also won the state of New York, which was Grover Cleveland's home state, by a small margin. Many people believe there were widespread bribes in the state of New York as well. Harrison went on to win the Electoral College majority because of winning New York. And Cleveland decided not to dispute it, but that became the impetus for many states to adopt a secret ballot. The idea that voters were being bribed how to vote became a major scandal around that time, and states began to change their laws to the ballot we have today.
So 1888 was when bribery was rampant.
Yes.
Was it rampant on both sides? Were both parties doing it?
Yeah. They were both doing it. In this particular election, the Republican bribery became the big scandal because it was revealed in that letter that was sent from the Republican National Committee treasurer, but Democrats were doing similar types of things.
So they were the ones caught red-handed in this case.
Right. The Republicans were, yes.
And the positive thing that came out of that was the secret ballot.
That's right. Now no one knows how you vote, so if someone wants to bribe you how to vote, they can bribe you all you want. You can just go in the private voting place and vote differently.
Well, that was the 19th century. Now we get into actually deep into the 20th century, because we're talking about just a few of the most contested elections. And one of the more famous ones that comes to mind was the one in 1960. Chicago's Mayor Daley was the central figure in this one. It was the Kennedy election, Kennedy versus Nixon. Can you describe that particular contested election and why it was contested?
Yeah, the nationwide popular vote results, that of course is not how we directly choose a president in the United States, but the nationwide popular vote results, it was the closest election of the 20th century. Kennedy defeated Nixon nationwide by only about 100,000 votes, which was 0.2% of the difference. Extremely close election nationally. Kennedy, because it was so close, Kennedy beat Nixon in a large group of states by less than 1%. In particular, there were disputes about Texas and Illinois. Texas was the Democratic vice presidential candidate, Lyndon Johnson's home state, with lots of history of corruption, and there were many Republicans claimed that Lyndon Johnson was down there fixing votes and stuffing ballot boxes. What got even more attention and more controversy was in Illinois, where Chicago Mayor Richard Daley was known for running the Chicago political machine of Democrats. And there were many, many accusations that Richard Daley had stuffed the ballot boxes in Illinois to help Kennedy win Illinois on election night, particularly when it took them so long to report the results. There were newspaper investigations done which indicated there probably was some skullduggery going on in both Texas and Illinois. Richard Nixon, to win in the Electoral College, actually would have had to win both states. He couldn't have won with just Illinois, which some people, I think, believed at the time and still believe. Illinois would not have done it by itself, but Illinois and Texas would have given Nixon the Electoral College, but Nixon decided not to dispute it at the time, to his possible credit, and instead decided to run 8 years later for president again and won, and that, of course, becomes history later on with what happened to Nixon.
In another election year.
Yeah, in a different election year, yes.
Well, one of the things about that election in 1960 there's so many things interesting about it, but we know that old-time politics were at play here. There was that saying in Chicago, vote early, vote often.
Right.
And then Mayor Daley, there were ward people who got themselves into trouble, and they found dead people who had voted.
Right.
And that was not uncommon, actually, in Chicago.
Or in Philadelphia at that time, actually.
Right. And so those kinds of things happened. And there were certain techniques that I thought was interesting about the way the Chicago machine had kind of influenced the vote. Some of the things that I read, they would have election judges who would look the other way when people voted twice. A lot of times there would be people in certain precincts who were mostly Democrat. There weren't as many election overseers who were Republican. And then you had a Democrat machine that would, as you mentioned, buy drinks for voting for the right people. They had to count on people because there was a secret ballot then, but they would buy drinks for people and sometimes, I guess, bribe them in their own way. And there were precinct captains would steal blank ballots and mark them and give it to someone to turn in. So they had all these different ways to influence the vote. And I guess when you step back now, you can sort of laugh about it, but that's some pretty serious stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is, and that was in the old days when we had paper ballots, and it's one of the main reasons why states across the country switched to various types of voting machines to vote in more modern elections. But then, of course, those voting machines have now presented new problems, including what happened in Florida in 2000, which we'll probably talk about in a few minutes. So, yeah, I mean, but if you have paper ballots, I mean, if you look back through history, there have been a lot of non-presidential elections that have been disputed, and a lot of it was due to paper ballots and people stuffing ballots and people marking ballots in ways no one could recognize. And we had the dead people voting. One story I like to tell my students that comes from Pennsylvania. In 1976, there was a longtime Democratic congressman named William Barrett who was known for his constituent service, and people in South Philadelphia loved him. He actually would take the train home from Washington to Philadelphia almost every night to serve his constituents with various problems. And in 1976, William Barrett died a couple months before Election Day, but his name was still on the ballot. And then on Election Day, he won in a landslide, the dead guy. And there was a joke in Philadelphia at the time that in Philadelphia, so many dead people were voting that they had now elected one of their own to Congress. So sort of a joke about the history of corruption in Philadelphia is similar to what you were describing in Chicago.
Chicago and Philadelphia and probably a few other places.
Right. Yes.
There were a few newspapers right after the 1960 election that wanted to contest it. In fact, I forget which newspaper it was, but they had already run a series of articles trying to expose the corruption in that election. And it was actually Nixon's team, I read, that kind of told them to back off. We're going to concede this. We're not going to push this.
Right.
Is that the case?
Yes, that's correct. There were several Republican newspapers who were doing investigations, and they seemed to be finding some credible evidence that there was corruption going on in Illinois and Texas and maybe a few other states. It's not clear if what they found was enough to change the outcome of the election, but yes, the Nixon campaign had said, we don't want to pursue this. This is not what our political ambition at this time, and they actually asked the papers to stop doing that, and that was the end of it. And Nixon, like I said, to his possible credit, decided for the good of the country and for the good of the political future of the country, it was best not to keep this election dispute going.
That was a classic case, and other things that I've read about it basically reinforced what you've already said, that even if there were certain results that were questionable coming out of the city of Chicago, that doesn't necessarily mean he would have won the state legitimately, and he definitely would have needed both states to win the presidency.
That's correct, right. Yeah, even if he had won Illinois, it would not have been enough in the Electoral College.
Then there was the other election that's a little bit more current, and some of the players are still around, and that is George W. Bush versus Vice President Al Gore in the year 2000. And anyone who remembers that election might remember it as the Hanging Chad's election.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you explain what happened in that case?
Well, there were lots of different election disputes in that election, but the Hanging Chad one in particular was that Florida, one of the ways in which states replaced the old-fashioned paper ballots, which caused such a mess in the 1960 election, was they got these new voting machines, and one of the newfangled voting technologies of the 1960s was punch card technology, which might have been newfangled in the 1960s, but by 2000 it was hopelessly outdated. It was a horrible way to vote, which it's not allowed in our country anymore. But with those punch cards, it's hard to describe for younger listeners to this, but computing in the old days, in the 1960s, 1970s, before we had personal computers, you had these sort of rectangular manila punch cards, and in order to program a computer, you would punch little rectangular holes in those cards. And so punch card technology was based on that, and the way most of Florida was voting in 2000 is they would punch these tiny little rectangular holes from a punch card, from a manila punch card, and that would be how they voted. The problem is that these holes were very small. We have a state filled with senior citizens, and many senior citizens perhaps didn't have the eyesight to see that the holes. Basically what happened is the punch card reader, after people voted, a punch card reader would count the votes at the end of the night. And if you had not punched the hole out fully, the punch card reader would not read your vote. You were instructed before you handed in the punch card to make sure the little punch hole was punched out completely. It was called a chad. When the little piece of paper fell out of your punch card, it was called a chad. You were instructed to make sure the chad is punched out fully, but perhaps some senior citizens could not see that the chad was not punched out fully. Plus, you also had to have some physical strength. And there were perhaps some, older people who may have had a little bit difficulty punching out the hole strongly enough. And so you had tens of thousands of these punch cards where people had gone to vote that day in Florida, yet the punch card machine claimed these people didn't vote for president. And there were actually at least 60,000 of these punch card ballots where people had showed up to vote on Election Day and then didn't vote for president, which made no sense at all. And so Al Gore went to court and said, I want the punch cards counted in 4 particular counties. The reason for that is Florida state law says if a candidate contests the vote, you have to file a suit in each separate county. And so Al Gore decided to focus on 4 counties who he thought would have results favorable for him, and said, I want the punch cards counted by hand. And that was actually Florida state law. If there's a disputed vote, you're supposed to count the punch cards by hand. Interestingly, Texas had the exact same law signed into law by Governor George W. Bush, which said in the case of a disputed election, you're supposed to hand count the punch card ballots. But in Florida, George Bush did not want the punch card ballots counted, because if they were counted, he might lose the election. So Al Gore tries to get 4 counties to do it. There's all kinds of disputes about that. Eventually, the Florida State Supreme Court says, look, we should not just have a count in 4 counties, we should have a hand count of the ballots in all of Florida's counties, statewide. There should be a statewide hand count of all Florida ballots to find these punch cards that registered no vote for president. And someone should actually look at these cards and see if we can figure out how these people intended to vote. And that hand count began. In the middle of the hand count, statewide hand count, the United States Supreme Court stepped in, issued a preliminary injunction to stop the hand count immediately, and then a few days later issued a decision in which they said, number one, the state of Florida needs to have a statewide standard for how to hand count ballots. There needs to be instructions to the people counting the ballots how to hand count them. You need a statewide way to do that. But the U.S. Supreme Court turned around and said, look, even if a statewide standard was possible, we're out of time. Congress set a deadline for states to choose their electors. The deadline is today, basically. Time's up. George Bush wins Florida. And that was the final result.
Well, that was December 12th, I believe, when the deadline was. So
Yes.
Al Gore conceded on December 13th.
Right.
And that gave George Bush a little over 1 month before the inauguration to do his, well, he was probably already working on it, but do his transition team.
Correct.
But as you mentioned, there were 60,000 ballots in Florida, and most of them were punch cards registered with no vote. And there was another problem with a ballot that I thought was interesting, and they used the term butterfly ballot.
Yes. What it was, those punch cards, you actually did not punch the little hole directly. The punch card was not in front of you. What it was, you had a piece of paper with the names of the candidates, and below the names of the candidates would be the punch card. And you actually had to punch out a hole on a piece of paper with the candidate names on it and the punch card below it, which shows you had to have some strength to do it, and you had to have good eyesight. This is the problem with the whole punch card balloting. So with the butterfly ballot, what the election official did in just one county in Florida, in Palm Beach County, is she decided there were so many presidential candidates, because it wasn't just Gore and Bush, there were all kinds of third parties running. She decided, instead of having the candidates in one long column on one side of the ballot, which would have required the font size to be tiny for senior citizen voters, she put the names of candidates on both sides of the ballot of the punch card.
The left and the right.
And the left and the right. And then and there were holes in the middle to vote for the candidate you wanted. Which is why it became known as the butterfly ballot. There's candidates' name on both sides, holes in the middle. The problem was the candidate names and the holes didn't match up very well. And what happened is that Pat Buchanan, who was the Reform Party candidate for president, Pat Buchanan, who was known at the time for his strong anti-immigration views, was also known for defending Holocaust prison guards who had been discovered living in the United States after fleeing Nazi Germany. And they're now living in the United States. They were going to be deported. Pat Buchanan said, oh, they're old, leave them alone, even though they had been Nazi concentration camp guards. So Pat Buchanan had a reputation for being somewhat anti-Semitic, potentially racist. Palm Beach County is a county which is filled mainly with Jewish senior citizens and African Americans, not the type of voters who usually would support a candidate with a reputation for being racist and anti-Semitic. But Pat Buchanan won 3,400 votes in Palm Beach County, Florida, which was his best county in the entire United States, his percentage of the vote. In fact, Pat Buchanan did 7 times better in Palm Beach County than any other county in Florida. Pat Buchanan even admits himself those people did not intend to vote for him. But because of the way the ballot was set up, Pat Buchanan probably got about 3,000 votes that were instead intended for Al Gore. George W. Bush officially won Florida by 537 votes. So when Al Gore lost 3,000 votes due to ballot design to Pat Buchanan, that cost Al Gore not only Florida, but the entire presidential election. I bring this up to my students sometimes, and they say, well, those voters were stupid when they couldn't figure out the holes and all that. I said, well, that may be correct, but there is no intelligence test to vote for president in this country, and if the ballot confused those people, whether they're stupid or not, that's a problem. And that ended up basically determining the winner of the 2000 presidential election.
Plus, I think there's the issue of consistency. If one county is using a different type of ballot than another, then you don't have consistent results.
That's correct. And in fact, Florida state law specifically said that all candidate names were to be to the left of the punch card holes on the ballot. So the ballot actually violated Florida state law. The problem is no one even noticed before Election Day. So, I mean, not only are you correct that it needs to be consistent, it violated Florida state law. And people went to court and said, this is ridiculous. We should have a revote. But judges said, no, you can't have, the rest of the country's already voted. We can't have Palm Beach County, Florida voting on a separate election day and by themselves determining the winner of the election. So those results stood.
And unlike the 1960 election, the 2000 election, the controversy in Florida could have tilted the election one way or the other. It all came down to those counties and those votes that they were counting.
That's correct. It was so close, yeah. And as I said, Bush ended up winning Florida by only 537 votes. And by winning all of Florida's 25 electoral votes, he only won the state by 0.01%. But because Florida, like most states, has a winner-take-all system in the Electoral College, he won all 25 electoral votes. That gave him a 271 vote total. You need 270 to win. Without Florida, Al Gore would have been president.
That was 2000. A lot has happened since the year 2000, and we've had controversies about other elections, but they haven't risen to the point where there's been necessarily proof like this, we're talking about here. How have the people in charge of elections changed the voting to make it a little bit more secure?
Well, for one thing, we've changed the way we vote. Punch card ballots, Congress in 2002 passed the Help America Vote Act. And one of the things it did is it funded the purchase of new voting machines at the local level by any state that said we're going to get rid of punch card machines. And most states agreed to it. Interesting, one of the states that did not do that was Idaho. And the last I heard, there are still one or two counties in Idaho using punch card machines. So if you want to vote that way, move to Idaho. But most states, including Pennsylvania, including all the big states, got rid of it. Pennsylvania, for the most part, a lot of counties, including Erie County, where I live, use touchscreen machines. Which have their own problems, and these are the kinds of machines that people say could be rigged by hackers and Russian trolls and things like that. A majority of people in the United States now vote by through what are called optical scan ballots, which are paper ballots, but you fill in a little circle. So if you fill in a little circle, to students I compare it to their SAT tests, where you fill in a little circle in the multiple choice tests, and they feed those into a machine. And then the advantage of that over perhaps the optical scan machines, it's a little messier because there's paper involved, but on the other hand, you have a backup, so you can't claim someone hacked into the machine or anything like that. Most Americans vote one of those ways today, and those are probably the main ways that have changed since 2000 to prevent that from happening again.
I think there's a lot of speculation. There will always be disagreement on how secure we can make it and how vulnerable these systems are to hackers.
Right.
Do you think no matter what they do, there will always be somebody saying that an election was rigged, or do you think there is ever a way to put that to rest?
Probably not completely. Whoever loses the election will always claim they were cheated in some way. We do have to remember before the 2016 election, Donald Trump was claiming he thought the election was going to be rigged against him, and then it turned out he won. So it turned out
he did not contest the election.
Right, he did not contest. It turned out the way he wanted, so it was okay. But yeah, anytime. We've had congressional elections and state legislative elections decided by 1, 2, 3 votes, and of course the loser is always going to say something was rigged in some way. There's never any perfect way, but basically election officials do the best they can. One interesting thing that I teach students about our country compared to other countries, the people who run elections are always these nonpartisan bureaucratic officials. They're trained to run elections, and they're civil service employees, like people who work for the post office, and they're nonpartisan, and they don't care who wins, and they just administer elections. The United States is rare, if not unique in the world, in having partisan officials run elections. We in most states elect the person who runs elections in the state. The county officials are in Pennsylvania are appointed by elected county officials, and they appoint someone to run elections. It's often a partisan appointment. This seems bizarre to people in other countries. And this, it became a factor in Florida in 2000 in that you had partisan election officials determining the winner. And the governor of Florida, of course, was the brother of the presidential candidate, Jeb Bush. Is here, running elections in a state where his brother is on the ballot running for president. How can you really depend on that to be a nonpartisan, neutral administration of elections? Most other countries don't have that issue.
Well, you're talking to students. When you look at all of these situations, what do you say is the primary lesson learned in all of these scandals?
Oof, wow. I guess just make things better. Keep trying to make things better. I mean, we did improve the way people vote since 2000. There were other problems in the 2000 election that we fixed since then, since we now have provisional ballots. In 2000, if someone showed up to vote and their voter registration was missing, and there was a widespread problem with that, not only in Florida, but here in Pennsylvania with my students, a lot of their voter registrations were missing. There was nothing you could do. You just didn't get to vote. Now we have, because of that election and the Help America Vote Act, we have provisional ballots where people who show up, their voter registration is missing, they cast a vote, and election officials try to determine if that vote should be valid or not afterward. So, I mean, I guess what I tell my students is just, instead of just throwing up your hands and say, that's the way it is, let's try to figure out how to make it better. And I teach them a lot about the Electoral College. I teach them how other countries elect their leaders, and I ask them which way is better. And, let's actually look at other countries. Sometimes they do stuff better than we do, and let's try to learn from them.
Robert Speel, thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, Tim.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Robert Speel, and you'll find some interesting articles on contested elections in history. You can also listen to other episodes, and if you liked this episode, make sure to review it and rate it, especially on iTunes. And don't miss the next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find on your favorite podcast channel and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.